You are now listening to the Vegan Stuff podcast with Caavakushi.
Hosting this podcast today are our two AI hosts, Sam and Kim. If you simply can't get enough of us, go to caavakushi.com and sign up for our vegan newsletter and get our free 7-day high-protein vegan meal plan. And we also have some good news. We will be releasing our first ever cookbook pretty soon, so stay tuned. Hey, don't forget to follow us on our socials too.
Right now, in the dense forests of Sweden, the government isn't just, allowing hunters to shoot an endangered predator.
Right.
They are actively paying them to put it in their crosshairs.
Yeah, which is...
with the explicit, publicized goal of cutting the entire country's population of this species in half.
Exactly.
Welcome to the deep dive. We are unpacking a massive brewing storm in Northern Europe regarding wildlife conservation, and today's stack of sources is entirely focused on the wolf.
And the situation unfolding in Scandinavia, it really represents this fundamental stress test for global conservation norms.
For sure.
We're looking at a scenario where the mechanics of international environmental law are just colliding head-on with local agricultural economics and, deeply rooted hunting cultures.
Our mission today is to pull apart this stark contrast.
Yeah.
Because we have the grand overarching ideals of international conservation efforts on one side.
Right, the big picture stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the gritty, highly contested, boots-on-the-ground reality in Sweden and Finland on the other.
It's a massive disconnect.
It really is. You are going to see how legal mandates, complex population genetics, and fiercely localized political pressures are all fighting over the fate of a single apex predator.
And to understand the gravity of this, we really have to look past the surface level debate of, pro-wolf versus anti-wolf.
Right. We're not doing that today.
No, we need to examine the structural mechanisms that actually allow a country that's bound by strict European environmental treaties to execute the largest modern cull of a protected species in its history.
So we've gathered a pretty comprehensive stack of sources to guide this analysis.
We have.
We're pulling technical data and scientific pushback detailed in Science magazine. We have investigative reporting on the ground from The Guardian.
And we're looking at the intricate policy and bureaucratic maneuvers tracked by Euractiv.
Right. Plus, we're incorporating the fierce advocacy and legal strategies of environmental groups covered by Common Dreams.
So it's a wide net.
It is. And the goal here isn't to take a side in the hunting debate.
Not at all.
The goal is to dissect how a policy this aggressive actually functions, like how the legal system is fracturing in response and why this regional conflict threatens to rewrite environmental law for the entirety of Europe.
Well, the logical starting point is the sheer scale of the Swedish operation.
Right. The numbers.
Yeah, the raw numbers provide the necessary context for why this specific cull has triggered such an unprecedented international backlash.
Let's look at those numbers because the data reported by The Guardian is honestly arresting.
It really is.
We are talking about a confirmed body count of at least 54 wolves shot dead by hunters in a single season.
Yeah.
But it's the proportion that matters, right?
Exactly.
Prior to this cull, the entire estimated wolf population in Sweden was hovering around 460 individuals.
Which is already a very small number.
Extremely small.
Yeah.
Taking out 54 animals from a population that small isn't some minor management adjustment.
No, it is a massive demographic amputation.
Wow. Amputation is a good word for it.
And the 54 wolves culled, that's just the immediate tactical result.
Right.
The overarching strategic goal announced by the Swedish government is to actively reduce the population down to 170 to 200 individuals.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They are literally aiming to halve the population.
Okay, let's unpack this. Usually when we talk about endangered species, the conversation is about, preventing accidental decline.
Right.
But here, we have a government actively paying to have a population. It's like a firefighter paying someone to fan the flames.
Yeah.
It completely inverts our standard understanding of conservation.
It does. And to understand why conservationists view this as catastrophic, we really have to look at the mechanics of wolf population genetics in Scandinavia.
Okay.
Because they are unique and, honestly, highly fragile.
So let's break down that fragility. If a population of, say, deer drops from 40,000 to 20,000, the genetic pool is still vast.
Sure.
But when you are dealing with a few hundred apex predators, the math changes entirely, right?
Drastically. So the Scandinavian wolf population, which moves fluidly across the border between Sweden and Norway, is essentially a genetic island.
What do you mean by an island?
Well, these wolves were completely extirpated, just wiped out from the region by the 1960s.
Oh, wow. Completely gone.
Completely. The current population did not naturally rebound from some hidden local remnant.
Okay.
It was founded in the early 1980s by just 3 to 5 individual wolves.
Wait, 3 to 5? Total.
Total. 3 to 5 wolves that migrated from the Russian-Finnish population.
So you have a foundation of just a handful of animals.
Yep.
That immediately sets the stage for a severe genetic bottleneck.
Exactly.
I mean, every single wolf currently roaming central Sweden is essentially tracing its lineage back to those original founders.
Which leads to a dangerously high coefficient of inbreeding.
I can imagine.
In population genetics, when closely related individuals mate, the probability of inheriting 2 copies of a deleterious recessive allele just skyrockets.
Okay, so what does that actually look like for the wolves?
In the Swedish wolf population, biologists have documented severe inbreeding depression. It manifests physically.
Like how?
We're talking lower litter sizes, higher pup mortality, congenital heart defects.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, and skeletal anomalies like severe spinal deformities.
That's heartbreaking. But, okay, if the genetic pool is that shallow, isn't the standard biological solution the rescue effect?
Right. Introducing new DNA.
Exactly. Why aren't new wolves simply migrating down from Finland or Russia to mix with the Swedish population and refresh the gene pool?
Well, because of human geography and agricultural policy.
Okay, explain that.
The northern half of Sweden is designated as a reindeer husbandry area. This is the traditional territory of the indigenous Sami people who rely on massive herds of free-roaming reindeer.
Got it.
So the Swedish state maintains a strict zero-tolerance policy for wolves in this northern region to protect the reindeer economy.
Meaning, any lone wolf migrating from the Russian-Finnish border has to run a gauntlet of hundreds of miles of zero-tolerance territory.
Exactly.
Just to reach the breeding population in the south-central forests.
And they are almost invariably shot before they make it.
Wow.
The south-central population is walled off not by oceans or mountains, but by a heavily managed, lethal agricultural buffer zone.
So they're completely trapped.
They are. Therefore, the genetic diversity of the 460 wolves in the south is all they have.
Right.
When you institute a cull of 54 wolves, you aren't just lowering the total head count.
You doing permanent damage?
You are indiscriminately severing vital branches of a highly vulnerable family tree.
Yeah.
It increases the likelihood of the population collapsing into an extinction vortex.
That biological reality makes the government's policy seem completely counterintuitive.
It really does.
I mean, usually when a government looks at a genetically isolated, bottlenecked population of an endangered species, state resources are deployed to protect it.
Yes, normally.
We fund anti-poaching units, we create protected sanctuaries, we build wildlife corridors.
Right.
But the reporting in our sources shows the Swedish state actively financing the reduction.
Yeah.
They are easing the legal protections, organizing the hunting quotas, and explicitly paying to facilitate the cull.
What's fascinating here is how this represents a deliberate policy pivot. It's a total inversion of standard conservation mechanics.
Yeah, inversion is exactly the word.
The state has fundamentally reclassified the animal. Under traditional conservation models, an endangered predator is viewed as a keystone species.
Like a vital, fragile, load-bearing pillar of the ecosystem that requires stewardship.
Exactly. The Swedish policy strips away that ecological framing.
Okay.
By actively funding a cull to have the population, the state is legally and philosophically treating the wolf as an overabundance.
Wow.
It is managing the wolf with the same regulatory tools used for invasive pests or agricultural blights.
Which raises the obvious question.
Yeah.
What is driving a modern European state to reclassify an endangered apex predator as a pest?
That's a good question.
The justification has to be massive to warrant this level of state mobilization.
The engine driving this policy is the concept of social tolerance intertwined with rural economics.
Social tolerance, okay.
The central Swedish counties where the wolves are concentrated are heavily reliant on livestock farming, primarily sheep.
Right.
Furthermore, Sweden has a deeply ingrained hunting culture that utilizes free-roaming, GPS-collared hunting dogs to track moose and deer.
And wolves, being highly territorial canines, view a solitary hunting dog entering their territory not as prey, but as a direct canine competitor.
Precisely. The wolves attack and kill the hunting dogs.
Oh, wow.
They also predate on the sheep.
Yeah.
For a rural farmer or a hunter in Dalarna or Gävleborg County, the wolf is not some abstract ecological marvel.
No, of course not.
It is a daily, visceral threat to their livelihood, their property, and their heritage.
That makes sense.
The psychological toll of finding a flock of sheep decimated
Yep.
or a prized hunting dog killed creates immense localized political pressure.
So the government is calculating the carrying capacity of the land, but they aren't using an ecological formula.
No, and they don't.
They're using a sociological one. The carrying capacity is defined by the absolute limit of the rural population's patience.
That is the exact mechanism.
Mm.
The national government has assessed that the rural anxiety and economic friction have reached a boiling point.
Right.
The state argues that if they do not institute a heavily managed legal cull to relieve this pressure, the rural communities will take matters into their own hands through illegal poaching.
Ah, I see.
The state's position is that a managed reduction is the only way to maintain any level of social tolerance for the species' continued existence in the country.
But enacting a policy that aggressive treating an endangered species as a socioeconomic nuisance instantly shatters any illusion of domestic consensus.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, you cannot order the largest cult in modern history without triggering a massive counteroffensive.
No.
Which brings us to the intense domestic tug-of-war detailed in the coverage from Common Dreams and The Guardian.
Yeah, the domestic arena is where this policy faces its first mechanical stress test.
Right.
And the resistance is not purely rhetorical, It is highly structured and legally aggressive.
How so?
Campaigners and conservation organizations, like the Swedish Carnivore Association, are utilizing every tool in the administrative legal system to halt the state.
They are calling the call shameful and heartbreaking, but more importantly, they are weaponizing the courts.
Exactly.
And when you read the timeline of these legal battles and the sources, it looks like absolute chaos.
It really is.
We have a specific report stating that a Swedish administrative court stepped in and explicitly said no to licensed wolf hunting.
Right.
They issued an injunction to block the planned culls. Yet we have the hard empirical fact that 54 wolves were shot. If a Swedish court steps in and explicitly blocks a planned cull, how does a record-breaking hunt of 54 wolves still take place? Like, how fluid is the definition of legal here?
It comes down to a mechanical loophole in how environmental injunctions are geographically bound within the Swedish administrative system.
Okay, a loophole. How does it work?
So the national government, specifically the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency, delegates the authority to set hunting quotas to regional county administrative boards.
So the authority is decentralized.
Exactly.
The national government says, we want to reduce the population, but the local counties actually draw the maps and issue the permit.
Yes. And when an environmental NGO files an urgent appeal to stop the hunt, they cannot file a single blanket injunction against the entire national policy.
Oh, I see.
They have to file appeals against the specific decisions made by specific county administrative boards.
I see the loophole. It's a game of geographical whack-a-mole.
That is exactly what it is.
The NGO goes to the administrative court in Stockholm and argues that the call-in, say, Gävleborg County, violates environmental law.
Right.
The judge looks at the evidence, agrees there is a risk of irreparable ecological harm, and freezes the hunt in Gävleborg.
But the freeze only applies to Gävleborg.
Right.
Meanwhile, the neighboring county of Dalarna, or Värmland, has its own quotas and its own permits that have not yet been explicitly injuncted by a judge.
So the hunters just move.
The hunters simply shift their focus, or the regional boards issue immediate localized permits for adjacent hunting zones.
Wow. Because the legal system operates in weeks, but the call operates in hours.
Exactly.
By the time the conservationists draft a new 50-page legal filing to block the neighboring county, a coordinated hunting party with snowmobiles, high-powered rifles, and tracking dogs has already cleared an entire wolf pack.
The disparity in operational speed is staggering, and the government utilizes an aggressive appeals process.
Of course they do.
The moment a lower court issues an injunction, the hunting associations or the state immediately appeal to the Supreme Administrative Court to have the injunction lifted.
And while that's happening,
during this legal ping-pong, there are narrow windows of hours or days where the injunction is temporarily suspended pending review.
oh my God.
The hunters exploit those specific windows. A hunter might receive a text message at 5 a.m. saying the hunt is legal, and by noon, another text saying a court has halted it again.
But in those 7 hours,
The quota for that zone has been filled.
it paints a picture of a deeply fractured society.
It really does.
You have the urban centers, the courts, and the environmental NGOs desperately trying to uphold biodiversity commitments,
Right.
while the rural boards and the national political apparatus are actively overriding them through bureaucratic maneuvering.
It is an internal crisis of governance. Sweden is basically failing to synthesize its international environmental obligations with its domestic political pressures. And when a domestic system breaks down this spectacularly, the noise inevitably crosses borders.
You can't hide it.
A localized failure of environmental law naturally invites scrutiny from the supranational bodies designed to enforce those laws.
Which pulls us directly into the European standoff.
Yes.
This is where the local hunting dispute transforms into a massive geopolitical and scientific chess match.
Because the highest governing body for environmental law in this region is the European Union.
Right. And the intervention of the European Commission elevates this from a domestic squabble to a precedent-setting international incident.
Absolutely. The EU operates under a specific legal framework designed to prevent exactly what Sweden is doing.
Let's unpack that framework, because Euractiv and science both point heavily to the legal architecture the EU uses.
So, the cornerstone of Europe's nature conservation policy is the Habitats Directive, which was established in 1992.
Okay.
Annex 4 of this directive lists animal and plant species in need of strict, uncompromising protection.
And the wolf is on that list.
Securely on that list. Under Article 12 of the directive, member states are strictly prohibited from all forms of deliberate capture or killing of these species in the wild.
But international law always has a pressure release valve.
Usually, yes.
There is always an exception clause for member states to use in emergencies.
Right, and that valve is Article 16.
Article 16.
It allows states to derogate, to temporarily bypass the strict protection under very specific, rigorously defined conditions.
Like what?
A state can permit a lethal cull to prevent serious damage to crops, livestock, or in the interests of public health and safety.
Well, Sweden is clearly pulling the Article 16 lever, citing the serious damage to rural livestock and the socioeconomic impact on hunting dogs.
They are. But Article 16 has a massive, non-negotiable caveat.
Okay, what is it?
A member state can only utilize this exception, provided that there is no satisfactory alternative.
Like erecting subsidized electric fencing.
Exactly. And crucially, that the culling is not detrimental to the maintenance of the species population at a favorable conservation status.
Favorable conservation status, FCS.
Yeah.
This term appears constantly in the sources. It sounds like a vague bureaucratic buzzword, but it seems to be the entire fulcrum of the conflict.
It is a highly specific mathematical and ecological threshold.
Okay.
To achieve favorable conservation status, a population must have sufficient natural range, adequate habitat, and robust population dynamics to ensure its long-term viability.
Right.
The entire conflict basically boils down to who holds the authority to define the math of FCS.
Sweden is looking at their localized models and saying, we calculate our favorable conservation status at 300 wolves. We currently have 460.
Right.
Therefore, we have a surplus of 160 wolves. We can safely have our population down to that 300 baseline or even lower without violating the Habitats Directive.
While the independent scientific community, the conservation NGOs, and the European Commission look at the severe genetic isolation we discussed earlier and completely reject that math.
They don't buy it at all.
Not for a second. They argue that a genetically bottlenecked population of 300 is an ecological fiction.
Wow.
Independent models suggest a true FCS for an isolated population requires 500 to perhaps over 1,000 individuals to prevent long-term genetic collapse.
So they are telling Sweden, you do not have a surplus. You are operating in a severe biological deficit.
Exactly, which leads perfectly to the core accusation from the European Commission.
Right, because the sources report the EC is expressing severe doubts that Sweden's reporting on its wolf populations is actually science-based.
Yeah, and in the sterile language of international diplomacy, accusing a member state's environmental policy of not being science-based is a devastating indictment.
It's a huge deal.
The EU is essentially accusing the Swedish government of fabricating or manipulating their ecological modeling purely to manufacture a legal justification for a politically motivated cull.
It creates a fascinating epistemological crisis.
It really does.
Because if a member state produces a 500-page report using their own national wildlife biologists, citing their own telemetry data, and concludes a cull is scientifically sound,
Yeah.
but the governing union looks at the same forest using independent geneticists and concludes the exact opposite,
Right.
who decides what reality is, whose facts have legal supremacy?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, ultimately the European Court of Justice holds the supremacy.
Okay.
If the European Commission believes a member state is violating the Habitats Directive, they initiate an infringement procedure.
Which is?
This is a formal legal process that can end up before the EU courts, resulting in massive financial penalties for the offending country.
And the sources indicate there is already a pending EU court case regarding Sweden's wildlife management.
There is.
But here is the massive structural flaw in that system, and it's why the EU is facing a brutal two-front war of criticism.
Yeah, the enforcement issue.
Right, because the environmental groups aren't just angry at Sweden, they are furious with the European Commission itself.
They are.
They are accusing the EC of failing to enforce its own laws and abandoning the Swedish wolves.
It exposes the chronic weakness of supranational enforcement.
Yeah.
The EU possesses immense legislative power, but its enforcement mechanisms are notoriously slow, bureaucratic, and completely detached from the immediate physical reality on the ground.
It feels like we have a referee, the EU, who is looking at the playbook, looking at Sweden's actions and saying, we doubt your math, this play violates the Habitats Directive.
Right.
But they're hesitating to actually blow the whistle and stop the game.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, everyone in the stands is just frustrated and screaming at the referee to do something.
And the referee can issue a formal letter of notice. They can escalate to a reasoned opinion. They can file a lawsuit that will take 3 to 5 years to wind its way through the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg.
3 to 5 years.
Exactly. But the referee does not have an EU federal police force to deploy into the snowy forests of Dalarna to physically confiscate hunting rifles.
The legal machinery moves at the speed of years,
Yeah.
but the hunting machinery moves at the speed of bullets.
That's exactly it.
By the time the EU Court of Justice issues a definitive, binding ruling that the Swedish cull of 2026 was illegal and violated favorable conservation status,
The 54 wolves are already dead.
the genetic lines are already severed.
The biological damage is permanent and irreversible.
Which means a member state can essentially price in the legal risk.
Oh, totally.
If the political reward of appeasing the rural voting base outweighs the delayed threat of an EU fine 5 years down the road, the state will authorize the cull.
They're calling the EU's bluff.
And if Sweden successfully calls that bluff, if they openly challenge EU environmental norms and execute a massive cull while the bureaucratic wheels slowly turn in Brussels,
Other nations are going to watch that playbook,
exactly, they're going to realize the referee is too slow to stop the game.
which guarantees that this policy will not remain contained within Swedish borders.
Right.
A legal precedent of this magnitude inevitably creates a ripple effect across the region.
Which pulls Finland right into the spotlight.
Yes.
We are moving from a localized Swedish anomaly to a coordinated Nordic trend.
Because Finland shares a virtually identical geographical, cultural, and ecological landscape with Sweden.
The socioeconomic pressures in the rural areas are mirrored perfectly across the border.
They really are, and the reporting from Euractiv highlights this geographical expansion.
Right.
Finland is now initiating its own wolf hunting initiatives.
And exactly mirroring the Swedish timeline, Finnish conservationists are immediately rushing to the courts to raise legal concerns.
Utilizing the exact same arguments about the Habitats Directive and genetic viability.
So what does this all mean? We have two neighboring countries simultaneously testing the waters of wolf hunting against conservationist pushback.
Yeah.
Is this just a coincidence, or are we seeing a broader Nordic shift in how endangered predators are tolerated?
Well, the echoes are deliberate. The Finnish government is observing Sweden's legal maneuvers.
Making notes.
Basically, yeah. They are watching how Sweden navigates the injunctions, how they utilize the Article 16 exceptions, and how the EU responds.
But what are the specific local pressures driving the Finnish government to adopt this stance? Is it just a copy-paste of the Swedish agricultural complaints?
It is rooted in the same fundamental conflict between urban conservation mandates and rural livelihoods. But Finland has its own specific nuances.
Okay, what kind of nuance?
Similar to Sweden, Finland has a vast northern region dedicated to Sami reindeer herding, which dictates a zero-tolerance policy for predators in that zone.
Right.
But in the central and eastern regions, the proximity to the Russian border creates a different dynamic.
Because there is a theoretical influx of wolves from the Russian population?
Yes, the Finnish population is slightly more connected to the larger Russian gene pool, but the rural anxiety is identical.
So the farmers are still worried.
Oh, yeah. Finnish farmers face significant livestock depredation, particularly concerning sheep.
Okay.
Furthermore, the Finnish hunting culture is deeply reliant on free-running hounds.
Just like Sweden.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The loss of a highly trained hunting dog to a wolf pack is a deeply emotional and economic blow to a rural Finnish family.
So the local pressure on the politicians in Helsinki is functionally identical to the pressure on the politicians in Stockholm.
Yes, the rural constituencies are demanding action.
And in Finland, there is an additional layer to the government's justification, isn't there?
There is. Finnish authorities heavily lean on the concept of management hunting to prevent poaching.
Okay, how does that work?
The argument is that if the state completely bans legal wool hunting, the sheer frustration of the rural populace will result in a massive spike in illegal, unrecorded poaching.
They call it SSS, right? Shoot, shovel, and shut up.
Exactly.
Mhm.
The Finnish state argues that a strictly controlled, legal cull is the only way to maintain the authority of the state in wildlife management.
Wow.
They claim that allowing a small percentage of wolves to be hunted legally provides an essential psychological release valve for the rural communities.
And that increases their overall social tolerance for the remaining wolves?
That's the argument.
It's an incredible paradox. We have to kill a percentage of the endangered animals to prevent the locals from illegally killing all of them.
Yeah.
How does the European Union respond to that specific psychological defense?
Well, the EU and the European Court of Justice have hilariously rejected that argument.
They don't buy it.
No. The courts have ruled that you cannot use lethal derogations under Article 16 simply to increase social tolerance or to preempt hypothetical illegal poaching. The derogation must be tied to preventing specific, measurable, serious damage.
But again, proving that damage and proving there was no other alternative like electric fencing requires an exhaustive administrative process.
And while that process drags on, the Finnish government, just like the Swedish government, pushes forward with the hunt.
Oh.
We are witnessing two neighboring countries simultaneously testing the absolute limits of centralized EU conservation mandates.
It represents a broader, organized, regional pushback.
It really does. For a livestock farmer in eastern Finland or a hunter in central Sweden, a directive written decades ago by bureaucrats in Brussels.
Dictating exactly how many apex predators they must tolerate in their backyards.
Exactly. It feels like an intolerable infringement on their national sovereignty and local autonomy.
They view the EU as prioritizing a romanticized, abstract concept of biodiversity over the tangible safety and economic survival of its own rural citizens.
That sentiment is the bedrock of this policy shift.
Yeah.
The national governments of Sweden and Finland are making a highly calculated political calculus.
They are choosing to align with their domestic rural constituencies.
Actively deciding that absorbing the legal friction and potential future fines from the European Union is a price worth paying for domestic political stability.
It is an immense gamble, and the stakes are the survival of an apex predator.
Absolutely.
We have covered incredible ground today, unpacking the sheer density of this environmental conflict. Let's trace the arc of what we've discovered.
Okay.
We began by confronting the shocking empirical reality on the ground. A state-funded Swedish cull where the government is actively mobilizing its resources to achieve the publicized goal of having the population of a genetically fragile, endangered species.
Resulting in dozens of wolves shot in record time.
A policy that completely inverts the traditional mechanics of conservation, transforming the wolf from a protected keystone species into a socioeconomic liability to be managed downward.
Right. And from there, we dissected the chaotic domestic tug-of-war.
We saw how the Swedish legal system was weaponized by campaigners,
creating that geographical whack-a-mole where administrative courts tried to freeze the cull through localized injunctions.
only for regional wildlife boards to instantly open neighboring zones, allowing the hunters to outpace the judicial process.
Which naturally escalated the conflict to the supranational level. creating a standoff with the European Commission.
We explored the deep technicalities of the Habitats Directive, the critical debate over favorable conservation status, and the epistemological crisis of the EU publicly doubting the scientific validity of a member state's ecological models.
And we saw the severe limitations of the EU as a referee.
Possessing the legal authority to condemn the action, but lacking the immediate enforcement speed to actually halt the bullets.
Yeah.
Finally, we watched this policy leap the border into Finland, proving that this is not an isolated incident, but a coordinated Nordic rebellion against centralized environmental mandates.
Driven by the shared rural pressures of livestock protection and hunting dog safety.
Throughout every layer of this conflict, the core structural tension remains the same. The violent, irreconcilable clash between localized social tolerance and international treaties designed to protect biodiversity at all costs.
And this is precisely why this deep dive matters to you, the listener, regardless of your geography.
Definitely.
This is not merely a regional dispute over a specific canine in a specific forest. What is happening in Scandinavia is actively setting the precedent for the future of international environmental law.
That's the real takeaway here.
How the European Commission ultimately handles Sweden and Finland's defiance will dictate the enforcement mechanisms for every single protected species across the European continent.
If a modern, well-resourced nation can successfully manipulate the definition of favorable conservation status, utilize disputed scientific models to justify having an endangered population, and outrun the EU courts through bureaucratic speed,
The entire legal architecture of wildlife protection becomes fundamentally hollow.
it shifts the baseline of conservation from a standard of absolute ecological necessity to a sliding scale of political and social convenience.
Which is a terrifying prospect for conservationists.
Which leaves us with a truly lingering thought today.
Yeah.
We started this hour examining the expectation of precision in conservation, the belief that an endangered designation acts as an invisible, impenetrable shield of legal protection.
Right.
But as we've dismantled the mechanics of these culls, we've seen that the shield is entirely dependent on the speed and willingness of a governing body to enforce it.
It really is.
So think about this. If a supranational entity like the European Union possesses the ecological data to prove a cull is devastating to a species, but their legal machinery is too slow to stop the hunters before the genetic damage is done, who actually holds the power to define what conservation means in the 21st century?
Is it the independent geneticists modeling population viability?
Is it the international courts drafting directives in Brussels?
Or is it simply the Regional Wildlife Board sanctioning the person holding the rifle in the snow?
It is a question of structural power that reaches far beyond the fate of the Scandinavian wolf.
It truly does.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep examining the mechanisms behind the headlines and keep asking those hard questions.
Thanks for listening. We hope you liked this episode. If you did, we'd really appreciate it if you could give us 5 stars on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. Also, we would be so appreciative if you could just share this episode or this podcast with all your friends and family who are vegans or vegan friendly. We're also really excited because we are going to be launching something really cool pretty soon on the site, so keep an eye out for that. And we will see you really soon with a new episode.